Hello again, mathletes. Today what we're going to be looking at is one of the uses for factoring. We've been going through and seeing all the different ways we can factor polynomials, and one of the uses for that is to actually solve polynomial equations. So equations that have polynomials in them. And so to do that, we need to focus on something called the zero product property. Now, the zero product property is actually something you already know. It basically states that if you have two numbers multiplied and the answer you get is zero, the only way that can happen is if one of those two numbers you multiplied is a zero, at least one of them, because they could both be zeros as well. So stating it really looks pretty much like this. If I have two numbers, a times b equal to zero, then either a equals zero or b equals zero. And we have to remember in math, or means that both could be zero as well. So you can choose both of them, and that's still part of the or. Okay. Now this ends up translating in a bunch of different ways. Because if I'm looking at something like x times y equals zero, that translates pretty directly to either x equals zero or y equals zero. Right? And that would be those would be the two solutions. You have solutions if x is equal to 0 or if y is equal to 0 or both. But stuff we've looked at that are two quantities multiplied together often look like things like x minus 2 times y equals 0. Well, that's still two numbers being multiplied. X minus 2 is a number and y is a number. So x minus 2 equals 0 or y equals 0 are the natural next steps on this. Over here, this isn't completely solved yet. I still don't know what x is. So if I add 2 to the other side, I get that x is equal to 2 or y is equal to 0. And these end up being my two solutions for that. Now, I'm going to erase some of this here so we can take a look at ooh, boy, that erased more than I thought. Okay. I'll just go like that. All right. So if I end up with something that looks like this, and you notice the equal 0 is the necessary part here. You have to have a 0 on one side for this to work. But this is still two quantities being multiplied by each other. And I'm getting a product of 0, which means that one of those two quantities has to be equal to a 0 for this to be a true statement. So that means that either x plus 3 equals 0 or 2x plus 1 equals 0. Well, both of those are equations to solve. And so here, if I subtract 3 from both sides, I end up with x is equal to negative 3. And over here, if I subtract 1, I get 2x is equal to negative 1. And then dividing by 2 gives me x is equal to negative 1/2. Now, that means that this particular equation has two solutions. So my two solutions are either x is equal to negative 3 or x is equal to negative 1/2. And you can list both solutions there together. There might be a number of ways that your homework asks you to list the solutions. They may be listed separately like this, like those two. They may be listed together like this, or sometimes they get put into a solution set, in which case they would just be listed and the squiggly brackets are put around them. Right? And so those are all different ways of representing the solution. So you can either put it in a set notation, collecting it together as a solution set. You can list them, or you can write each of them separately. And technically, there really should be an or between those two solutions if you're going to write it that way. Okay. Now let's take a look at a couple more examples here. Now, most of the time, though, it's not factored when you get it. So you actually end up looking at things like this. Let's try that square again. x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Now you notice I don't have any multiplied quantities here. I don't have this broken down so that it's two things multiplied by each other. So what I have to do is I have to create that. So as long as I have the 0 on one side here, I'm good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor this thing. And fortunately for us, this has a 1 out here in front. Since it has a 1 out there in front, that means that we can use the shortcut, right? So my master product is 6, and the sum I want is -5. And I can see that the two numbers that I need for this are -2 and -3. And so that means this thing factors down to x minus 2 times x minus 3. And I still have the equals 0 here, right? But you notice this is exactly the situation we had in the previous example. I have two things multiplied now to equal 0. And so the factoring is what let us use the zero product property in the first place. So here I have x minus 2 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. Between these two things, let's see here. Let's see what we can get. If I add 2 to both sides here, I get x equals 2. And if I add 3 to both sides over here, I get x equals 3. And so I have my solutions. X is equal to 2 or 3. Right? And you can check these just by going back. And by the way, if you're going to check them, go back to the original equation to double check. But you can always double check these by plugging them in. So if x is 2, let's plug that in and see what happens. So that means I have 2 squared minus 5 times 2 plus 6 equals 0. Let's see if that's a true statement. So that gives me 4 minus 10 plus 6 equals 0. And if we add those things up, we do in fact get 0. 0 is equal to 0. And so this checks out, right? And you can do the same thing with 3. If you plug 3 in here, this one should work too. 3 squared minus 5 times 3 plus 6 equals 0. So that gives me 9 minus 15 plus 6 equals 0. And if I add up the left-hand side here, I end up with 0 equals 0 again, which is another true statement. And so these two solutions, these two numbers here are actually solutions to this original equation, even though we took this odd little way of getting a hold of it. We had to do it by factoring. Okay, and so that's the basics, right? So anytime we want to solve one of these equations, we make sure we have a 0 on one side, right? So get 0 on one side, right? 2 factor, and 3 set each factor equal to 0. Ooh. And solve. Right? And I apologize for my handwriting. It's getting towards the bottom of the screen there. It's hard to write on. But that is the basics. So whenever we're handed one of these things, this one was kind of fortunate because we already had 0 on one side. But we get 0 on one side. We factor the other side. We take each factor and set them equal to 0. And then we solve the resulting equations for the complete solution. Now, I do want to warn you, this doesn't solve every equation, right? It just doesn't, because not everything factors. So it has to be a factorable equation. And so that's pretty much what we're going to be looking at. As we go through the next chapter, we're going to see other methods for solving these when you actually can't factor, right? All right. Now, so that is the conclusion of this video. I'm going to be doing more examples in the next video, and I will see you guys in the next video.